Tonight, we are reborn.
Please cleanse me.
Purification always begins in disorder.
Why?
This cannot be.
It was never their souls that needed cleansing.
The poison sermons the cup that ended the choir. I set down the first line by candlelight and could feel the room shrink around the ink. The flame threw a private theatre of shadows across my page, and the words I traced were measured steps away from confession. I have kept records for years, for petty magistrates and for hungry monks, for merchants and magistrates, but never with a weight like this. The ledger I now close is not a chronicle of trade or law. It is a slow, deliberate inventory of how faith was hollowed and how men drank from their own unmaking. The gatherings began like any other prayer meeting hidden beneath city roofs. We met in cellars because the daylight belonged to the public churches and the law. Secret rooms offered a sanctuary that felt holy as long as the candles burned and the roof did not creak. Donato built the sanctuary with his voice. He cultivated a particular light, a rhetoric that made confession into ritual and ritual into remedy. People came to be absolved, to be made clean. He called the remedy a purifying cup. I am Alessio. I held the quill. I sat at a table strewn with wax and notes and the small brass scale that Lucia used when she weighed bitter herbs. I watched more than I took part. That was how I justified myself for a long time. Observation was not the same as complicity. The truth proved, with time, that observation without interruption was its own kind of consent. Donato wore his piety like armor. He stood taller than his age, hair slicked and beard thin and carefully trimmed, his visage lit with a counted intensity. He moved slower than the world around him and spoke with the cadence of scripture. His robe was ornate but austere, a contradiction that kept his audience thinking both reverence and fear. Matteo walked beside him as a shadow made of muscle, keys and rope at his belt. And his presence at the door was a reminder that choice in those rooms meant surrender. Lucia worked behind a low shelf, hands steady, weighing and pouring, a small woman with a small brass scale and a discreet intelligence that never betrayed her. The sermons were less sermon than choreography. Donato would incline his head and set the space into a rhythm. He taught them to count their sins, to find the precise measure of guilt they each carried. Then he promised the cup. Purification, he said. A final straightening of the soul so that citizens might live unburdened by the past. The language was simple but precise, and in that simplicity it carried an arithmetic designed to remove uncertainty. Those who drank would cleanse themselves. Those who refused would bear the stain. They were hungry for absolution. Florence has always been an apron of contradictions, art and hunger, luxury and rot. In a city that celebrated images, Donato succeeded because he made a sacrament that felt like a visible truth. The cup was tarnished, its rim wormed by time, a relic with the weight of history and the warmth of ritual. He handled it as a reliquary and fools bowed to its rim. I wrote every sermon into the margins of my book. I recorded how Donato gestured when he spoke of mercy, how the choir hummed under the flicker of candles, how the people leaned forward as if leaning closer could pull them through. I recorded faces. Anna sat near the front, hands folded over a faded locket, a bruise along her temple like a private flag of endurance. She was quieter than most, her eyelashes heavy, always following the motion of the cup as if it were a compass for her grief. There were other men who worked the docks, a woman with a newborn wrapped close, a retired soldier who had come to atone for acts that would not fit within a single lifetime. They came with faults and grievances and, crucially, with hope. Lucia supplied the mixtures, and therefore she supplied trust. Her bottles clinked softly when she moved. She ground bitter roots, smoked herbs on embers, and measured with an almost mechanical precision. No one in the room thought to look behind her shelves for proof that all vials were what they seemed. Her station had been earned over years of treating fevers and soothing stomachs. She had a steady hand and a cleanness of manner that reassured even the most suspicious neighbor. Her small brass scale was a crucible of authority in those low, lit rooms. The mechanics of the ritual were exact. Men and women queued with their palms exposed, a single goblet passed, often from Donato, always accompanied by a blister of incense and a short benediction. Matteo watched the edges, the escape routes, the people who might slip away with a secret in their mouth. The procession was intended to be both spectacle and coercion. Each person who drank believed that their action rippled outward as moral testament. The chorus hummed, the candles trembled, and the room narrowed around the sound of breath and the clink of metal. I had been convinced, in my way, because I wanted to believe that what we recorded mattered. I told myself that describing Donato's rhetoric would expose its artifice, that by placing his patterns on paper I could unmask the mechanics of seduction. In a quieter, truer admission, I wanted meaning as much as they did. I wanted to be part of something that turned ordinary fear into rarefied purpose. The first time someone fell ill after the cup, we named it tragic coincidence. A woman staggered, her skin blanching, her hands folded over her chest. Matteo seized her and carried her to an outer room. People stared. Donato took off his stole and placed it over her shoulders as if to conceal the rupture. He explained that sometimes purging takes form as chaos before it becomes clarity. The language soothed doubt. We moved on. I wrote the incident down with small, neat strokes as though I might thereby render the event harmless. A pattern emerged. The illnesses repeated, not always immediately, and always with a similar chemistry to them. They were not fever of the street. They resembled a sinking inward, a collapse that ate breath. People whispered of fate and sin. Donato invited them to speak their confessions and offered the cup as a resolve. He told them that to drink was to be remade. The idea of voluntary absolution can look like redemption when you do not know the source of the remedy. I watched Lucia work differently with certain flasks. She used a small vial that she kept close, that she did not bring to the table for public view. She handled it with both discretion and care. Once I leaned in when she turned away and saw the dull sheen of the liquid inside. It was not the color of the mixtures she dispensed for fever. It was clearer, with a metallic glint like a blade seen at an angle. When I asked myself why she would keep a second vial, my hand trembled over the quill and I found the answer by writing it down instead of seeking explanation. The choir began to thin. Those who had drunk more than once grew quieter, hands trembling like leaves. They spoke less of work and more of dream. People began to speak in absolutes, as if life had become a ledger with fewer columns. Some left the city altogether, muffling their faces against the wind. Others remained to swell the voice of the congregation, to speak of the cup that had saved them. There were pages of praise, and among them the small, precise lines that did not fit into a hymn, dates of illness, a bruise that appeared the day after, a child who slept without waking. I should have destroyed the vial when I saw Lucia hide it beneath her cloak. I should have shouted or fled or taken the brass scale and tipped it so the weights would scatter. Instead I wrote, "There is a cowardice in keeping records when used as protection, a superstition that if you name the harm, you can control it." My writing became surveillance and indulgence at once. I recorded times and who carried what cup, and who complained of taste, and who fainted in the dark. I catalogued the voices until they became a texture I could rid like a fabric. The night the choir drank together, the room held a brittle expectation. Donato moved through his ritual like an actor at the close of a long play. He spoke of an end that looked like a beginning. The candles were crowded close to one another, their halos overlapping until the room was a pool of fragile gold. Matteo stood near the chest where the cups were kept, his posture deliberate and closed, a mechanical sentinel. The people were reverent. They drank in procession. Anna, as always, lifted the cup with a tenderness that made me ache. When the chair that held Donato's cup was placed back on the table, I saw Lucia's hand linger just a fraction of an inch longer than it had before. Her fingers were stained faintly with ink and earth. She moved with a precision that no casual observer would notice. Later, under the green light of dawn, I traced the rim of the communal cup and found a hairline scratch near the lip where a small seal had been placed and removed. The tack of the metal was not a sign of accident. It was an alteration. The first to fall that night did not cry out. He sank forward as if in a tired sleep. Others followed. There were sounds, not of pain but of the room attempting to rearrange itself around the new fact of silence. Matteo moved with a startling efficiency, pulling bodies behind curtained arches, slamming doors. Donato's voice, when it returned, was paper thin and remote. He spoke of sacrifice and of the cruel, tender hand of Providence. In my ledger I wrote down times of collapse and the arc of pupils constricting, the little convulsive tremor that never told stories like a fever could. When Donato lifted his own cup, the parishioners watched like a congregation waiting for light. He drank, and for a breathless span the room held what it had been promised a divisible absolution. Then his face changed. He clutched at his throat as if hands had turned to rope. He lurched. The room that had been a chorus collapsed into dissonance. I remember the way the light from the candles turned edges into knives and shadows into torn cloth. Matteo grabbed Donato, but his fingers came away stained with something that shone too bright to be sweat. Lucia moved as though her practiced calm had been rehearsed for this moment. She bent, retrieving a small vial from beneath her cloak, and tucked it into the seams of her robe with the efficiency of a seamstress. She did not fall. Her face was a composition of absence and intent. Later, when I met her among the overturned benches and the smell of iron and wax, her hands trembled in a way that suggested calculation more than compunction. We sealed the cellar in the hours after. The law sent men with torches, and the city learned a different shape of silence. Graves were dug, and the names were read aloud in the morning to steady the stomachs of kin. Donato's name became a cipher in the mouths of people who had once called him father. There were rumors of poison and accusations that cut like knives. Matteo was seen at the docks the day after with blood under his fingernails and a rope coiled like a wager. Lucia closed her little stall and left in the morning with her scales and a small sack of vials. Anna survived, but she carried the hollow of her eyes like a relic. My ledger sat open through it all. I had written the details not as a way to absolve myself, but as a way to map the event. In the mapping I found the shape of agency. It was both smaller and stranger than I had imagined. People drank because they were told to believe. Donato engineered belief. Lucia supplied means, Matteo enforced. I watched the apparatus grind and I wrote its teeth. The thing that had most surprised me was how ordinary the mechanics were. There was no monstrous genius, no secret cabal of demons. There was a priest with an ambition, a woman with knowledge, a man with muscle, and a populace etching to be better. Those immutable desires made a system that could kill with an ordinary cup. I could say now that I warn others. That is true insofar as words can be a lamp, but I cannot rescind the guilt of the page. I have rewritten the events a dozen ways in my head, each time trying to find a seam where something different might have been done. The stitch is always the same. I could have acted sooner. I could have upturned the brass scale, smashed the vial, cried out. I did not. I wrote. This ledger will outlive me only if someone reads it. It is the confession of a man who watched the mechanics of conversion and chose observation over interruption. It is a catalogue of how rhetoric becomes ritual and how ritual can be manufactured to elicit obedience. It is a record of how 1,000 small choices make a catastrophe inevitable. When I close the book tonight, I will rub my fingers over the rim of the cup I keep beneath my bed. The one I took when the cellar sealed and the men left. I carry it like a contrition. It is empty now, wax has dripped across its base, and the metal is pitted. But it was once the instrument of a promise. I would like to believe that the city learns that people will lay down their hunger for simple absolution and take back responsibility for each other. The ledger tells me otherwise. Human hunger is patient and eternal. People will always seek a simple remedy, and cunning men will bend that need into a ritual. The final line I write is not a plea. It is an accounting. I record who touched the cups, who kept the vials, who watched the bodies carried away. I write names and dates and the small, damning details that prove how calculated it had been. And I write the quietest confession of all, that the ink on my fingers could not be washed away by the sound of a bell. It is possible that in some corner of Florence another preacher will fold a similar liturgy and call it salvation. I leave these pages as a map of the mechanism. Read them and you will find cause to tremble, because the worst of it is not that men seek to harm, but that they can so easily make others believe that harm has been sanctified. The cup that ended the choir was not mystical, it was a tool. What remains is the hollow where faith used to be, and the names of those who drank while the candles watched and the scribe wrote. Chapter 2: The Scribe's Witness. I set down the quill and watched the candle gutter. The wax pooled like a pale wound upon the wooden table, and for a long beat I simply watched the way the flame tilted and mended itself as if making small, private decisions. I have always written in the margin where others overlook names, times, the particular smell that clung to a place. My hand learned the shapes of other men's truths before I dared assign them to the page. That is how this record began, not in an oath or revelation, but as the small, exact labor of an observer who believed accuracy might atone. The town sits in a bend of river and a fold of hill. Its roof's a tangle of stone and thatch that looks from a distance like a patchwork thrown down by a careless hand. Up close the stones remember where shoes have scuffed them. The alleys are narrow as a fist and keep secrets better than wide, sunlit squares. The church, with its crude fresco of a saint painted long before anyone remembered his name, leans as if listening for confessions from the roofs. Donato stood beneath that fresco on his first sermon, the candlelight catching the burned scar at his temple, the gold thread of his stole dull with dust. He had the look of a man who had practiced anguish until it became a costume. When he spoke, the hall went still in a way I had not seen since plague graves were carried by torchlight. Men and women arranged themselves in the huff, dark like ships on a river, oars stilled. The layout of faces became a mapped Matteo guarding the doorway, shoulders braced as if to hold back the world, to Lucia near the apothecary chest, her hands folded but not idle. Anna at the back, shawl drawn, her mouth a fine, hard line of expectancy. Donato offered absolution as if it were a map to cleanliness, and pinned to it a simple ritual, a cup passed among the faithful. A draught promised to cleanse conscience and body together. He called it purification. He called it mercy. The first sermons were tidy and convincing because they were small. Donato spoke of stain as if it were a material thing that could be removed with the right application. He spoke of the city's daughter houses, of debts unpaid and quarrels left to fester. And he fastened the cup to those complaints with language that felt like a tool more than a theology. A ritual was offered, a draught brewed with herbs, and a word of absolution, and people took it the way a burned child will reach for cool water. The first draughts did what any strong potion will: eases the stomach, warms the limbs, quiets some anxieties that had been fed by sleeplessness and cold. The miracle was small at first, to the miracle is always small at first. I was not the only one to take up the pen. The people brought tokens and hymns and letters that smelled of lavender and fear. Matteo kept order by the doorway, a shadow with a belt of keys and a rope, his jaw working like a millstone when a voice trembled. He had a way of standing that made men minimize themselves, a lowered head, and a hand near the rope to remind them of boundaries. Lucia, the apothecary, kept silent company near her shelf of vials and root jars. She moved with the careful economy of someone who had measured poisons and antidotes not for curiosity but to survive. She never wasted motion. Anna trembled at the edges of the crowd, hands folded, shawl clutched, eyes bright as someone who had learned to carry sorrow the way a child carries a stone. Her hands were always busy with something small, a coin to count, a petal to press, gestures that steadied her and made her look outwardly like any other pious woman. They wanted the cup. They desired it as one desires absolution, as an animal desires the shade. There was a posture in the room that reduced the world to that single need. The ritual cadence, a sermon, the lowering of the chalice, a blessing, the passing hand to hand became a choreography that shaped bodies. The cup became a focal point of hope. In the beginning the draughts did little more than ease stomachs and warm blood. But Donato spoke of increasing cleansing until the act itself became a test. Purify or perish, his followers began to say in low voices. The phrase crawled like a vine across the city, bright and green and strangling. Men who once argued about rent and tithers began to speak of sin as a stain that could not be washed but consumed. I chronicled these changes the way a surgeon catalogues the stages of an infection. There is a rhythm to such cataloguing: observation, notation, cross-reference, repetition. The zeal increased along the same axis as silence. When a merchant disputed the preacher's claim, Matteo's presence sufficed. He never struck in the open, at least not at first. His hand on the rope, a tightening of the jaw, a nod toward the doorway were enough to still conversation. When a woman questioned the safety of the draught, she was removed to an alley and returned with a quiet that looked like a bruise. People learned quickly that dissent was asymmetrical and dangerous. Lucia's handwriting, which I sometimes consulted for clarity in my own notes, remained unreadable in public. Her scripts in the apothecary ledger were spare and exact, the way a surgeon labels anatomy. When she poured, she did so with the attention of one who has counted both poison and antidote 100 times and knows that one dose can be the difference between cure and catastrophe. She owned, I realized before the rest of the town did, the apparatus of death and the ability to disguise it. Her vials, when examined in the dim light of her workshop, bore residue that suggested mixtures more complex than simple herbal tinctures. I remember the way she once wiped a brass scale with the hem of her apron and her hands smelled of iron. My duty as scribe became a strange double life. I recorded the public piety and I measured the private cost. I wrote how the choir's numbers thinned like a frayed rope, a husband who did not step out from his bed, a child whose cries ceased between one candle flicker and the next, a neighbor who woke pale and fevered and left the world with a smile of sudden calm. I wrote the names Anna murmured into her tattered shawl. I wrote Matteo's impatience when a man spoke against Donato. I wrote Lucia's hands when they worked the brass scales, the small metallic clink of weights that told me what the apothecary weighed as more than herbs. The process of turning ritual into compulsion is not abrupt. It moves by degrees, each small act convincing the mind it has crossed no threshold. Faith yields to habit, habit to custom, custom to coercion. When Donato began to speak of a final purging for those whose lives were beyond redemption, there was a hush of hunger in the room. Some saw salvation. Some saw escape from debt, from shame, from the slow curse of being a name on another person's ledger. Those were the first to volunteer for the last draught, stepping forward with faces like pale coins. Others were urged. The differences blurred until choice was a thin veneer. I kept tally. I could not help it. Tallying is the scribe's torment and solace. Numbers give a kind of sanctity to atrocity. They make it legible, quantifiable, actionable in a way that raw grief is not. At first the numbers were small and secret, 3 in a week, then 7, then a pair each dawn. The choir diminished as if a disease had taken an appetite. Songs thinned into a single note. The preacher's voice, however, grew thicker with triumph, as though each absence was proof of a cleansing working properly. He spoke as if abundance might follow, as if the city could be remade by subtraction. I blamed myself in private. I had supplied words for sermons. I had neatened phrases until they fit like bands. My pen had smoothed rough doctrine into lines the people could swallow. I was the one who had written in the margin what had been said so clearly that others believed it immutable. A scribe's sink is almost a sacrament. The hand that calls a man sinner is the same that signs his cessation into the ledger. The thought settled into me like a splinter. The more polished the language, the easier it was to swallow the act. The cup that ended the choir was not ornate. It was a tarnished chalice, dented at the rim, its silver dulled by breath and the fingers of 100 hands. Donato lifted it as if it were a relic, and the congregation bowed. He spoke longer that night, and the words were honey and steel. Rain pressed like a wet cloth over the city wind, scraped the shutters, and the cobbles flashed with reflected light. Candlelight made everything more intimate and more grotesque. He called for a final purification for those among them who had lived stained lives, and several citizens rose like reeds. I watched Lucia move at the back of the room. She carried a small vessel wrapped in cloth, and she placed it on the apothecary's table as if delivering a petition. Her hands trembled the way hands do when they know a secret has turned its eye to them. Matteo walked by her with a nod that was less comfort than confirmation. He met my gaze, and for one terrible heartbeat I believed he might speak. He did not. His face remained like flint. He glanced back once, tongue pressed to the inside of his cheek, as though tasting the shape of silence. It was the kind of silence that could be ordered, like a meal prepared, portion served. The draughts were poured. The first man drank, and for a breath the hall inhaled hope with him. He rose and went back to his seat, and his face went slack, as though a great weight had unmoored him. The second was less steady. I could see the tremor in his wrist, and the way his eyes tried to keep still in a face that would no longer obey the eye. They drank until several were rendered still. The air changed in those moments. It smelled of iron and wax and stitched fear. The lights seemed to fold inward until only the preacher and the chalice glowed with a horrible devotion. I do not remember the precise second when I realized the cup had been switched. Not the moment my mind first suspected, but the moment my body accepted it as a fact. It was after the third man sank and Anna began to shake, after Lucia shifted as if some old ache had moved within her bones. I saw the apothecary's cloth slip from the vessel beside her foot, and the glint of polished glass where once there had been laid a subtle, unreadable deception. The cloth had been neat, folded as if to hide something from the eyes of the pious. When it unfurled, it showed a different shape, slighter and clean, the sort of glass that held something refined rather than simple. My heart gave a quarter, beat thud under my ribs, and then went flat. Someone had taken what was meant for the many and replaced it with something singular. The cup that passed now bore a marrow different from before. The poison had been concentrated, refined, intended to take all at once, or to take power by choosing who lived. If guilt can be listed, then mine began with that gaze Matteo gave me. His eyes said there were things he could not say. They said more than his mouth ever did. He had known something or suspected it, and chose the safety of silence. Lucia had known. Donato, I later thought, may have known too, in the way a spider understands the pattern of the web it has woven. But, at that time, in that room pulsing with breaths that were not yet silent and those that had already grown cold, I could only record and not rescue. My hands had become instruments routed through obedience. What followed was a sequence of small violences disguised as devotion. The dead were wrapped and carried silently, their faces hidden beneath cloth that smelled faintly of lavender and wood smoke. The living were corralled into a hush that was both ritual and threat. Some of those who had initially drank found themselves cast out in the morning, their skins a grey parchment, their eyes hollow as coins. Families closed doors and locked shutters as if privacy alone could keep the contagion of thought at bay. Many were not allowed to speak at length. The preacher's logic closed around questions like winter closes around a hollow. Donato preached of sacrifice and of the purity of the city through blood. He taught a new geometry of morality where edges were sharp and mercy rare. Power swelled under his vestments and turned his face almost pleasant in that soft, dangerous way of men who believe they are ordained. I sought Lucia the day after the rite. She had closed her shutters and left her door ajar as if signal. There was a faint smell of herbs and iron in the air, the faint copper that clings to old hands. She stood in the candlelight of her workshop and looked at the instruments of her trade with a tired sort of pity. Jars of dried roots lined shelves, labels faded from many years of use, a mortar and pestle rested beside a tray of scales. She did not raise her eyes when I entered. She had not made any attempt to disguise the vessel she had wrapped. It lay upon the bench, glass catching a sliver of light, small and unassuming, its mouth narrower than a drinking cup, its form meant for precise doses rather than libations. She rinsed her hands and did not speak. I asked nothing. We stood and let the quiet answer questions we were not ready to voice. She moved to the brass scale and placed a single grain upon the pan and watched it tremble, as if that minute weight might dictate the shape of the world. The pan quivered, and the grain fell like a small, terrible seed. She spoke then, in a voice that was neither accusation nor apology, but a fact. I measured, she said. I weighed. Those words were both explanation and confession, and they made the room smaller. I left with both shame and a new, blunted anger. There was a comfort in the calculus of culpability. If I could enumerate who did what, then I had something like order. But some confessions have no audience but the page, and I began to write as if ink might burn. The city changed. The small courtesies that are the mortar of society vanished. Friends passed one another with looks of refusal. Neighbors met in the market with clipped nods as if distance could be negotiated with politeness. Rumors became the currency of the alleys. They were traded with a ferocity that arithmetic once reserved for grain. Families who had once dined together chose separate rooms so that grief might not be contagious, or perhaps because they had learned to hide their faces from one another. Matteo's patrols grew more regular, his hands were never empty now. He moved through the streets with a rope at his belt, and the knowledge that fear can be a tool of governance. Donato's sermons lengthened and the words turned inward. Preoccupied with lists and names, he spoke that the city could be saved if only the malefactors were excised. He painted himself as a blade. He also began to offer lists, names culled from the weak and the indebted and the inconvenient. The line between voluntary and commanded blurred until it was merely a seam in the cloth. I recorded confessions, transcriptions of depositions, the scrapings of grieving hands upon vellum. I copied wills and debts and notes that had been thrust under doors in the night. The more I wrote, the less surprised I became at the human capacity for rationalization. Language did the heavy lifting, a phrase here, a theological justification there, and suddenly the most ordinary selfishness resembled holy will. My pages filled with that slow, legalistic violence. I kept marginal notes, little notations of when a sentence sounded like coercion, or when a man's name reappeared on multiple lists. Those marks were prayers of a sort, desperate, practical attempts to create evidence for a later reckoning. I marked dates against names, cross-referenced those who had been present at the rites, noted who had handled vessels and who had turned a blind face. Anna survived. She walked the streets like someone who had been given back a coin of brittle metal and learned to carry it with both reverence and contempt. She would pause by an empty cup as if memory of the shape and sound of it might give her instruction. She would press a finger to her locket and whisper some syllable I did not need to transcribe. Her eyes stopped being purely frightened and became sharp with purpose. She visited graves the way other women visited friends. She would sit and trace names into dust and then fold her hands as if memorizing the stammered geometry of loss. She learned to ask direct questions at markets, to watch faces when they tried to turn away. In time, Chapter 3, The Cup's Reckoning. I have written and rewritten these pages until the ink has bitten into the grain of the paper, until my hand trembles less and the words lie flatter. Like a body set in the quiet after fever, I write because the act of recording is the only thing left that might the weight I carry, the weight of ordered lists of names, of times, of measured gestures that led so steadily to an unmaking. I write because the scribe must be precise. Details conceal nothing, and detail insists upon culpability. I believe that fact, as stubborn as it is, with the same stubbornness I once applied to neat lines and exact tallies, the ledger is not mercia. It is a small and terrible witness. The gatherings began as murmurs and ended as a ritual that tasted of copper. At first they were talk beneath breadlines and furtive notes placed under shutters, folded handbills with a single motif, the city depicted as a wound, raw at the center, and atop it a preacher whose hand offered a blade. Donato's sermons were never loud, they were exact. He shaped belief with a scalpel, trimming doubt until the congregation beat like a single heart. I observed him from the edge of the room, a low bench behind his intended audience, pen poised and the quill a narrow distance between what he showed and what he hid. He wore his silk-like armor deep crimson with matte gold trim, ostentation rendered into purpose. The chalice he raised gleamed with dull oxblood reflections as though it had already drunk shadows. Its weight and its shine were always emphasized. Feel the metal, trust the maker, trust me. Donato taught certainty by telling stories that refused to be disputed. He spoke of sin as contagion, of the city sleeping under some slow infection, of sacrifice as the only true purification. His rules were not spoken as commands. They were given as inevitabilities, a thin, merciless strain of truth that invited not debate but surrender. He described suffering as a scab that must be peeled away, and to hear him was to imagine one's pain neatly excised. Around him Matteo moved like an answer in muscle, a man whose jaw set the world to rights. Matteo's presence was punctuation to Donato's sentences, a heavy, clean stop that erased hesitation. Lucia, who kept her dispensary at the back of the hall, supplied mixtures he named rites. She wore her vials on a belt at her hip and handled glass with the furtive concentration of someone whose hands decide life and unlife. Anna came because she believed, or because grief hollowed her until hope was a thing she could trade for purpose. I watched them all and I kept my account. For a long time the chalice was only symbol. During sermons it reflected the candlelight, scattering amber slivers across faces like small promises. Men and women leaned forward as a child leans into story. The polished goblet held the lean and asked trust without entitlement. The first time they drank it was not as a choice, but as a tide of conviction led them. They took the cup with trembling hands, believing themselves cleansed. I wrote their names as their lips touched the rim, the baker whose thumb bore a burn, the widow who kept her late husband's coat in a cedar chest, the carpenter with soot in creases of his palms, a boy whose eyes were far too old for his face. I noted ages and occupations with the calmness of someone compiling census returns, because precision makes futures retraceable. A ledger is a map of what we believed we were doing. Lucia's mixtures changed over time in ways that should have been audible to anyone who watched her weigh and write. At first there were tonics that steadied a trembling body, tones of rosemary, bitter herbs to purge a fever, tinctures to calm a stomach. all normal remedies for a city that shivered with rust and damp. Lucia's work was precise. She annotated weight and temperature, and wrote in the margins little notes that read like the final rational lines of someone who steps into method and never questions it again. She kept a small brass scale at her station and could tame poisons into draughts that looked like gold. I watched her thumb tap the glass when she measured a measure. Later I would curse that tapping like a metronome calling time to death. Donato named the act of drinking purification. Layer by layer he stripped away old words for guilt and replaced them with ceremony. He spoke of sacrifice as renewal, error as a stain that could be washed away. He taught the crowd to look upon their suffering and call it rebirth, to look upon their neighbors and see only the possibility of absolution. In those sermons I noted the small motions, the tilt of his head at absolution, his slow gestures that mesmerized, the way his signet ring caught light a half-second before the congregation was asked to respond. I wrote every one because I believed the record could one day be laid against their souls and say plainly what had happened. Ritual becomes habit. Habit becomes expectation. Expectation becomes compulsion. The congregation came to nights lit only by candles, shadows pooling like ink in corners and voices muffled into hymns. They began to queue for the cup not as for treat, but as for obligation. Lucia's mixtures were altered to be bitterer, then thinner, then an eyes sore to disguise a metallic aftertaste. Matteo stood with his belt and his keys, and those who hesitated were ushered by a hand at the small of the back firm, guiding, unyielding. I marked the shifts in the ledger as if they were tied marks. Each small change was a new bruise. It was not an instant of madness. There were stages, each one recorded in the margins of my notebook like ticks on a clock. First, a few who drank fell ill and died. Families were told they had been chosen by Providence to accelerate their union with the divine. The preacher spoke of martyrdom, of purity beyond the body. The city frowned but did not yet speak openly. Then more drank, the ledger grew. The sick and dead became statistics that slid into ritual, a sacrifice expected and named. When a cluster of losses struck within a single household in the third week, grief simmered into doubt. Donato's parlance shifted subtly, the accusation of impurity narrowing until those who questioned were singled out by omission and by the weight of silence. It is a terrible economy. The more bodies one can explain away as chosen, the less one must reckon. My hand trembled the night I saw the switched cup. I had been sitting at the edge of the chamber, closer than usual, because Donato had gestured to me as he passed, and I had felt a strange obligation take the shape of an order to follow the flow of the ceremony. The hall smelled of tallow and diluted oils, a fresher odor iron, old and dry-edged the air. Lucia bent near the table to check a vial, and in the candlelight she moved with deliberate slowness, as if not to alarm the air. A glove of shadow fell between her and the chalice. In that shadow the cup was replaced not by clumsy exchange, but by a motion of surgical quiet, a sliding of one rim into another like two pieces of a machine finding their fit. I cannot say when the switch had been arranged, only that flash of shadow and the movement, practiced and sure. When the room had cleared, and the emptied goblets clattered, and the last of the candles guttered, Lucia was alone by the table with the chalice and her small brass scale. She turned it in her hands as if testing weight. Her finger brushed the rim, and I saw a flash in the glass that was not merely reflection. She closed her eyes, and I know now what she imagined measure and consequence at once. In my notebook I made a shaky ink blot. I wrote down a single line and left most of the page blank, as if the emptiness would not gather accusation later. The blankness was cowardice and foresight both. The eye can fill silence with a story if given space. There is a particular silence that precedes violence in a crowd, not merely an absence of sound, but a contraction of attention, a held inhalation because the story is about to be told. Donato performed that silence like an organist who knows where the chord must fall. He placed the chalice to his lips. The congregation watched the ritual completion with the fierce obedience of the devoted. He drank and then, in a motion that had become ceremonial, he lifted the cup to them. Matteo passed it down the front row, hands moving in a choreography nearly as practiced as the rites themselves. The cup went from palm to palm, faces set, children hushed by adults who had decided that their fear could be made holy. Afterwards, Donato faltered. He did not collapse like the others. He stepped back, his face drained to a color chosen from a palette of ash. His hands shook with an unfamiliar trembling. He steadied himself on the lectern and called out absolution once, twice, and then less like a priest than a man bargaining for purchased air. Matteo turned first toward him with a fury that was not the rage of grief, but the panic of a question that would not be forgiven. The preacher's eyes found Lucia across the room, and for a second the candlelight made her silhouette into an accusation. The hall seemed to tilt. Where before there had been the neat geometry of ceremony, now there was the messy curvature of panic. Lucia had expected to be unobserved. She had perhaps expected that the choreography of worship would swallow her smallest of alterations. She had not expected Donato's hand to falter. Yet even the best schemes slip because of small variables: a cough in the third pew, a child who does not yet understand ritual, a scribe whose duty keeps him awake. I saw Lucia set her lips into a small, precise line and leave the chamber with the measured steps of a person who knows exactly what she will be called to answer. The next hours were organized and terrible: Matteo securing doors, men dragging bodies into corners, women weeping in a way that was an attempt at noise to fill a room that must not be emptied. The weeping had a cadence that tried to resemble ritual itself, as though grief must be ordered if it were to be permissible. When we questioned one another, the words became thick like congealing broth. The first explanation given to the crowd was that some unseen hand had sought to corrupt the writer, a contamination of intent that had slipped unnoticed into the chalice. No one looked in that moment at the obviousness of an arranged exchange. Her outward blame is simpler than inward reflection. We called for confession and demanded names. Some names were offered by terrified throats, many were refused by teeth that rattled with loyalty. We needed villains as badly as we needed saints, and the mind is quick to complete both pictures. I began to examine Lucia's notes. Her script had the small economy of one who believes knowledge is currency. She had recorded formulas in shorthand, 2 drops of an extract from a seed that grows under stone, a tincture that causes a flushing of the face, followed by a slow closing of the lungs. She recorded quantities that could either cure or kill, and in a column wrote reasons for variation. There was a motion in her hand that suggested calculation, rather than zeal, the calculus of survival in an environment that grinds useful knowledge into leverage. I saw entries where she had balanced risk against need, scruples traded for outcomes in the way a tradesman bargains. She had saved some. In the ledger were names crossed, and then later annotated with small marks that suggested she had eased one back from the edge. In another column she'd noted those she could not save, a quiet, methodical resignation. The city's magistrates intervened at last, not out of mercy, but because public disorder had become inevitable. People demanded demonstration and spectacle. They wanted a visible punishment to anchor their chaos in story. Matteo, who had acted as guard and enforcer, became both judge and accuser in ways that turned muscle into the conveyance of the right answer. He walked with an urgency that frightened me, because urgency leans toward obliteration. When Matteo's men seized men and women suspected of tampering, they did so without the decorum of trial. They performed a swift, sort of justice demonstration of consequence to a crowd that needed a story to explain why bodies lay where they did. It was less about truth than about giving the city the illusion of rectified balance. Donato's fall was not the single spectacle I had seen rehearsed in my head. There was a ritual unmaking rather than sudden retribution. He sat at his table and was watched over like an object under inspection. Mercy, when it came, was measured out in language. Ironically, he fell under his own doctrine. His followers, having been taught that the removal of impurity requires the removal of the impure, turned his decrees back upon him. They recited his teachings as if reading from a ledger while they carried out his undoing. The same rites used to sanctify the cup were reinterpreted to justify cutting Donato from the body he had shaped. I recorded the recitations as well, the soft, obedient intonations of a crowd turning upon its teacher. Lucia was questioned behind the apothecary's shuttered workshop, among shelves bowed under labeled jars. She sat as one who had tidied herself for the moment of reckoning, fingers stained with ink, a faint burn along her forearm like a map of a guilty hand. She neither confessed nor denied with words. Her hands quivered with the careful motions of a ledger keeper. When I asked why, much later, she touched the glass on the nearest shelf and held my gaze with a look that suggested a ledger kept of those she had saved with other mixtures. She had been, for all her quietness, a guardian of power. Knowledge becomes leverage, and leverage becomes inevitability in a small world. She had used her skill as much to hold sway as to heal, and that truth is one we are slow to name. The survivors grouped themselves into small knots, those who had not drunk because they would not, those who had been spared by absence, those whose lips had touched the rim, and who now moved like people who cannot quite find their place in the world again. Anna was one of them. Where others held shipping registers and household ledgers, she held memories and a locket with a portrait blurred at the edges. She walked as someone who had learned to move within the narrow tolerances grief allows. She stared at cups and rims the way one stares at a wound that will not close. After the cleansing, she came to me in private, hands folded so tightly the knuckles whitened. She asked for nothing in loud terms because to ask is to presume a right to answer. She expected no answer. I think she came because the ledger was one place where suffering might be made legible. What I have recorded is not the story of sudden descent. It is the account of a slow folding of choice into compulsion, of a charismatic hand shaping ritual until it consumed a city's capacity to think. The poison that killed was not merely a substance, it was an idea introduced into a polity of anxious hearts and left to do its work. Each dose was measured in human terms as if devotion could be tabulated. We found lists where names had been crossed out in a tired hand and new names added in a fresh script. Some had volunteered, some had been chosen. Some had been turned inward by the need to belong. There were small notes in the margins who hesitated, who drank with a smile with the ordinary, chilling notation of human behavior. In the end, the chalice lay empty on the table, a cup emptied of meaning and then of life. I wrote those final entries in a state that was not collapse of the body, but of the map my conscience used to navigate, who was guilty and who was a vessel of circumstance. My ink blurred with rain because after the festival of candles a storm came and the roof leaked where the rafters were old. I left stains on pages where I had once tried to be precise. Those stains have become part of the record now. They are as much testimony as any neat line. They are a reminder that even the neatest ledger cannot wholly contain the weather of the heart. I cannot say that justice was fully served. There were executions drawn and sentences pronounced. There were confessions made with the brittle screams of fear and something like relief. Some walked free because power believes in its own immunity. Some were swallowed by the doctrine they had helped spread. Donato, who sought to remake the city, left behind a pulpit turned into a relic of decay. Lucia returned to her work with a wariness that is not absolution but function. Matteo continued to walk with a firmness that seems now a little vacant, as though armor has replaced conscience. Anna collects names like small offerings and keeps them in the locket of her memory. The city learned to speak of. Chapter 4, The Quiet Calibration. I wrote because writing was the only honest labor left to me. The quill scratched across rough paper, each line a measured incision, a catalogue of choices I had watched unfold and, in the end, permitted. Memory arranges itself in exactness, the tilt of a head, the scent that follows a man like a second skin, the precise weight of a cup placed in a trembling hand. I record these because truth, when set down, resists the erosion of rumor and the soft rot of polite silence. I record because to remember is to accuse the air. When the sermons began, the room was not yet a room of graves. It was a cellar behind a chapel, a place where wine once slept in barrels, and where rusted nails had been hammered to keep rats at bay. The stones were damp and the rafters' low breath condensed in the light of tallow. Donato spoke to us as though he were already speaking from a pulpit of stone. He made the cellar a womb of absolution. He taught a language of small cruelties that promised grand designs. Every gesture was tempered, every phrase chosen to tighten the knot in a listener's chest, until the throat yielded confession as if it were currency. He knew the architecture of attention the way a hand extended, the pause before a name is given, the lowering of eyes, and used that architecture like a mason uses scaffold. I had delivered his phrases faithfully into ink. I had learned the cadence of his sermons and set them down as if transcribing scripture. To scribe is to be a midwife to memory, neutral, exact, responsible only for the fidelity of transcription. This is a convenient fiction. Each ledger I filled contained more than words. It contained the shape of his persuasion and the seams where men and women had been fitted to his design. In my ledgers the folds of a sermon unspooled like a map, invocations at the margins, a repetition that lured, then the offering of the cup that sealed assent. The pages keep what the mouths hide. The first time I saw the cup I thought it an ordinary thing, a chalice, not new but not yet hollowed by use. Donato raised it with ritual care, let a candle lean toward the rim so flame licked the silver and made the metal seem alive. Faces reflect a holy sheen, in such light faces become maps of devotion. He called the act purification. He called it courage. He called those who would not drink weak. He made the material simple and the meaning immense. A cup is only a vessel until someone names the act of lifting it as an act of salvation. I wrote the phrase, and the phrase became provision. People who had been pained and poor found meaning in the ask. The preacher's words aligned with the hunger in hearts. He promised greater things. He promised a final mercy. Those promises do not come to those already broken. They come to those who believe in a design that runs beyond pain. The cup clean, polished, ordinary made the act sacred. It is easy to forget how hunger and hope conspire. A man who has lived 18 winters with an ache in his side will trade a small death for a promise of peace. The cup transformed small deaths into proof of faith. Donato never drank with us. He raised the chalice, intoned absolution, and watched. His abstention was an emblem. It put him in the position of one who returns sacrifices with an altar untouched. Matteo oversaw the distribution, efficient as a man who sees threat as a thing to be contained by hands and ropes. Matteo's footsteps made the flagstones answer. His presence was a metronome that measured obedience. Once he lifted a man by the collar who refused to drink and held him like a lesson until the man's jaw unclenched. The man drank. I wrote the account with an even hand and felt my pulse pause when the man's eyes lingered on mine. That look was a ledger too, an entry of accusation folded into the other pages. Lucia was the woman who measured the mixtures. She kept her implements, closer glass vials at her belt, a brass scale with a patina of years, a strip of parchment on which she calculated ratios with a pencil of soot. She spoke rarely, and when she did it was with the precision of someone who reads chemical temperaments like faces. In the corner of the cellar she made tinctures that stilled a fever or steadied a broken limb, and for that the crowd hungry for miracles called her grace. They did not credit the cost of knowledge, how exactness requires a ledger of failures, of beakers stained with experiments gone wrong, of hands that learned by hurting and by measuring the hurt into doses. At first the switch was subtle. I did not think it a switch. I thought it an error in placement, a missit goblet, a trimmer of hands. The sermons had a ritual rhythm: invocation, absolution, the offering of cups, the moment when the congregation bowed and drank. A silence would follow, long enough for the body to register and then to respond. That silence became a measure by which I read fate. When the cup at Donato's side was changed, I wrote of a shadow that tasted of iron and herbs. I called it a faint alteration in flavor because naming it murder would be irrevocable. There are words that once spoken make a history of what follows. I hesitated because to place murder on ink was to place it on the world. There is a peculiar quality to watching someone realize they have been made into a cipher. Donato was always precise in his composure. He moved like someone who believes posture is the first prophecy. The night his cup was altered, he kept the same composure: tilted head, measured breath, hands that had practiced the art of absolution, but his eyes tightened. They did not lose the calm, they sharpened into something remorseless. He tasted, and seemed to calculate the angle of the wrongness on a plane I could not chart. Time for him became a set of gears to be inspected and corrected. He did not seem startled so much as offended, as if a text had been miscopied and therefore insulted. It is a mistake to imagine that those who command cruelty always relish the pain. For Donato, cruelty was a tool, a grammar to sculpt a new architecture of obedience. When a tool ceases to obey its master, the master grows interested in calibration. He did not unmake the act, he rearranged it to refine its efficacy. He asked questions with a voice that seemed to steady the space between heartbeats. He did not shout. He did not need to. He used the ledger of our fears. He could make a man confess to unknown sins without raising his hand, simply by suggesting inquiry and letting silence do the rest. Matteo's zeal grew like the swell of a hidden tide. He responded to the switch not with perplexity but with friction. He tightened logistics, double-checked drinkers, rearranged the order so that those most resistant were served first and watched by others until they drank with trembling hands. I wrote the changes in his methods as if listing the movement of furniture in a house, yet every arrangement was a small strategy of control. Order, when imposed like a blade, cuts its own name into the air. Matteo began to divide rows, to station watchers in doorways, to assign watchers to watchers until observation became the mode of faith itself. Anna survived. Her survival is a small miracle that has become a heavy thing I carry. She returned to the cellar like a spectre whose living weight took on the features of defiance. She wore a tattered shawl and kept her gaze on the rim of any cup she saw. She watched the mouths of others like a sentinel cataloguing departures. Her voice was fragile, but her eyes catalogued each name of the absent. People moved away from her as though the air around her had scraped clean and left visible stains. Yet she would not speak of drinkers and pourers with the bluntness that convicts. Her resistance was softer, more cunning, an entire refusal disguised as fragility. I feared for my staying. Every ledger I filled implicated me. To record is to hold a map of cause and consequence. To hold the map is to be witness to the road. Yet leaving required admitting a shame I could not make whole in absence. I stayed because I wanted to know the limits of what men might call devotion and what I must call betrayal. I stayed to watch the moment the instrument grew sharper than the hand that had wielded it. And I stayed because removal would have felt like a betrayal to the one who taught me to read ink remembers, even when people forget. Lucia's role in the switch was never simple. She knew which combinations would numb pain and which would rearrange cognition. She also knew that powders could be sweetened to hide bitterness, and that a single mislabel could alter an epoch. When I confronted the algebra in her vials, she showed me a patience that was not denial but a calculation of survival. Her eyes measured consequences the way a surgeon measures a pulsar. It was always about the minimization of risk to herself and, perhaps perversely, the maximization of her control. She kept me at a distance with the soft, clinical tone of someone who has learned to keep fingers away from emotional fires. She never spoke of intention as a moral axis, instead she always framed actions in balances of harm and utility, as though every act could be amortized. The congregation's faith had a horsepower that frightened me. Men and women came as if to harvest absolution. Some sought atonement, some sought belonging, others the taste of finality. There were nights when the cellar thinned like a lung, and then filled again with the sound of people who had lost names, but not the desire for purpose. Purpose, once given an architecture, becomes immovable. Donato gave us a scaffold and then invited us to climb. Those who fell were not spared by mercy. They were subsumed into the architecture of consequence. I watched families remake themselves around the ritual meals rearranged so that the cup was the focal point. Stories revised to include a line of gratitude to the order that provided meaning. The institution devoured life and gave back a language to describe that hunger as piety. There is a manner of silence in rooms that have accepted fatality as an act of ritual. It differs from the silence of fear. It is a silence that glows with reasoned assent. Hands unclasped not because they were forced, but because a doctrine had replaced any other map. I wrote about this silence in measured lines, as if page could hold the temperature of a room. The scribe's hand learns to measure the space between two breaths. That space contains confession. When no one moves, the room becomes a clock. You can count how long it takes for the next body to submit, for the next throat to give over to the script that names salvation. I recall the night after the choir fell ill in a cluster. They were a fragile assembly, young men and women whose voices once braided into hymns. Donato selected them as examples of purity. The choir was to be the living chorus of the new order. When they went down, their collapse had a mechanical rhythm, and the room became an organ of grief. There was a smell sharp and medicinal and also metallic that clung to their lips when they could not sing. Matteo ordered a sealing of the doors. He sealed witnesses with a resolve that smelled of smoke and iron. He insisted on ritual privacy, on a kind of containment that isolated the event and allowed explanation to be shaped without interference. I wrote with a steady hand, though my fingers trembled. The ledger, at that point, was a map of an accident or a will. The distinction mattered. If the cause illness were an accident, it required penance. If it were will, it required judgment. When I finally recognized the switch as deliberate, the recognition came with the intimacy of betrayal. It is one thing to know that a procession leads to ruin. It is another to understand that a hand has altered the path. The hand belonged to someone who could weigh consequence and seize outcome. Not all plans are born in malice. Some are born in the cold arithmetic of survival and the desire to govern result. Lucia's calculations were that kind. Donato's were different. Donato sought a perfection of the fold. Lucia sought leverage. Both outcomes met in the same place. Bodies became tokens. They rationalized as those who have to keep a venture alive will by making the costs legible and the benefits immediate. A woman's fever stopped, a child's leg mended. The price voices, lives was accounted for in balance sheets only they could read. I have tried to chart the moving of cups, the alterations of orders, the conversations held in the dark between Matteo and Donato. There were no loud conspiracies, only incremental shifts, a phrase here, a shift of a goblet there, an instruction whispered like a recipe. My pages show a mind at work converting a rumor into certainty. I abhor the need to be precise about those whispers. I record them because the world will prefer myth if I cannot render the small mechanics that made it real. The conspirators were careful not to be conspirators in the dramatic sense. They were careful to be technicians, a hand that adjusted a ratio by a hair, a clerk who inserted a name into a rota, a man who rearranged benches to expose the doubters to the most watchful eyes. Each evening I sat with my ledger and the cup of tepid wine that steadied me. I ran a finger along the margin, the same motion I have used since I began to write. That motion became a ritual. In those moments I considered two answers, abandon and atone. Abandon would be a silence that allowed the system to continue its economy of ruin. Atonement would require a frank naming. Neither felt adequate. Atonement needed witnesses. I had witnesses in ink, but none in court. The law would hear the words of men who owed everything to the same structures. To speak aloud was to court danger for those who had nothing but a name. Even if the law were impartial, the cost to those I would wish to spare families, the innocent who came for absolution, would be immediate. My conscience weighed the lives I could imperil against the obligation to truth. Anna's survival was the hinge. She did not disclose the details of who had poured. She would not wield the language that would convict. Her resistance was not a public defiance, it was a private refusal to make story into spectacle. She kept the sight of the cup like a relic that had burned her and would not be passed. She refused to let the world take pity as an instrument. That refusal taught me patience. It also taught me that justice could be administered slowly and with the cunning of subtler hands. Her survival became a coda, a silent ledger in which her refusal to name was as meaningful as any accusation. She taught me that sometimes saving a life is about preserving the shape of that life, not about making theater with it. In the end, I made a choice that felt like walking across a field at night. I left markings in the margins that would expose pattern to someone who read them with attention. I rearranged the ledger in a way that hinted at sequences and placed names not for vengeance but for coherence. I moved notes from the foot of pages to the head, grouped entries so the recurrence of certain hands and certain vials would reveal themselves to an investigator who knew how to look. Whoever would come after an official with teeth or an inquisitor with a torch would be able to see that the ring had been set. I wrote with the slow cunning of someone who knows that paper can be a net, catching not men but patterns, and that a careful mind can follow the pattern where a mob follows a face. My ink is not the same as a summons, but ink can be the map that a determined hand follows. I hope someone will follow. I do not expect grand crowns to topple on the weight of a scribe's hand. History is not tidy. Still, I arrange the facts with the cold precision I have cultivated the time the choir fell, the order of cups, Matteo's adjustments, Lucia's ledger of recipes, Donato's measured patience. It is a geometry of intent. I leave no flourish that could be mistaken for sentiment. I write only the arrangements that link cause to consequence. What terrifies me is not the image of bodies reduced by poison, it is the ordinariness of the calculus that made it possible. Men and women who feel the bend of history under their feet can design systems to fit the bend. They teach others the posture required. They build scaffolds of language that allow cruelty to be called mercy. They convince enough people, and the weight of what they name replaces every other claim to meaning. The danger is not the monster who wears a mask and desires blood. The danger is the man who believes technique will make his world more stable and more holy. I continue to write. I clean my ink stained. Chapter 5. The choir falls silent. I have written these words because ink is the only witness I can still trust. The parchment does not flinch. It does not rationalize. It does not bargain for a softer memory. In the hollowed rooms beneath the chapel, where we once measured devotion by the tremor of a voice or the neatness of a signature, the records lie like bones arranged, catalogued and cold. I write to arrange, I write to catalogue. I write because I must breathe past the things I memorized, and because to breathe without writing is to let the air itself conspire to forget. I am Alessio, and I was the hand that held the ledger of the sermons, and the ledger that watched the cups go round. There is a sequence to ruin. It is not an instantaneous collapse so much as a steady, precise dismantling. One will call it madness, another fervor, another good intentions warped by hunger for meaning. I will call it craftsmanship. Donato built a machine of faith. Every sermon was a gear, every hymn a ratchet, every shared cup a lever. Matteo kept the machine clean of voices that bent at inconvenient angles. Lucia prepared the oil for its hinges, And I, who learned to measure words like potions, learned that a sentence could be as fatal as a vial. Anna survived what the machine spat out. She held what remained of our conscience like a threadbare shawl. When I first put pen to paper on this chapter, it was to mark what I thought was closure. The third chapter recorded the first bodies. The fourth recorded the cautious adjustments, the quiet calibration of poisons that would leave a ghost of pain and an absence of sound. Here, in the fifth, I collect the precise mechanics of the moment they stopped calling it mercy and began to call it deliverance. I will not speak in the language of courtroom absolutes. I will speak of ratios, timber the way a hand angles a chalice, so the light catches the rim and the congregation sees promise instead of steel. The preacher's voice was a surface. It reflected whatever heart was held before it. Donato could make a confession sound like a battle cry and a surrender sound like a covenant. His robes were a landscapey deep crimson, matte gold trim, and ox blood that carried itself like a melody through the room. He moved his hands as if conducting a choir no one else could hear. People followed because he created tiny sanctuaries within sentences. They followed because the world above required one to earn bread with labor and debts. Below, with the chalice, one could buy a different kind of purchase absolution bought with a single exhalation. The sermons changed over months. They began as meditations on weakness and sin, the old and dangerous ideas that made bodies curdle at the memory of guilt. But there was a new architecture to the didactic that Donato offered: purification as a custom, sacrifice as a public instrument of moral engineering. He taught that a shared act could cleanse, that a communal contraction of the chest could produce a new citizenry. He layered logic like mortar until the building he wanted to raise a people remained stood plausible. Within that blueprint he placed a centerpiece at the cup. It is easy to speak of the cup as if it were an object separate from intent. It was not. The cup was an instrument of attention. It drew the eyes. It provided a choreography. Donato polished its tarnish, so the congregation could see a distorted face of themselves in its glint and feel compelled to imitate the outline they saw. The chalice ritualized surrender. To drink was to consent in the most literal of private ways. To drink was to be erased together. Matteo knew how to shepherd consent into corners where it could be managed. He stood at the threshold of the underground room with keys at his belt and a rope that marked the boundary between those who would kneel and those who would be kept upright for correction. Where dissent lifted its head, he applied pressure. He did not torment for sport. His methods were efficient confinement, glare, threats of exposure. The zealotry he wielded was blunt and direct. He was the muscle of ritual now, and because ritual depends on spectacle, he ensured that spectacle would not be interrupted. Lucia's involvement was measured. She kept mixtures that did not look like mixtures to the untrained eye. Thin water, a tincture, a colorless tincture that burnt like lemon and left no immediate mark. She told herself she sold comfort. She told herself she made relief. But there were orders that came like an architecture of need. Adjust this drop. Make the bitterness softer. Change the lid on the vial so the scent is less noticeable. She worked with skill, the kind born from safety and repetition. She kept her loop at her throat and her brass scale at her hip like a map. In the ledger of her life there were precise notations, times, weights, reactions. She learned what the body forgave and what it could not. I recall the night the choir fell silent, because memory flings back at us the moments when light betrays. It was a night when candles bowed under a damp draught and wax fell in strings, when the rafters held a slow cuff of mold. Donato's sermon that evening was a hymn to clarity. People came hoping for answers. The pattern had been set 3 words, a pause, then the cup offered. I sat with the ledger open and the wax, stained quill-balanced like a bone across my knuckles, writing the litany of names as they came forward. I paid attention to the order, because order keeps blame manageable. It was then that I first suspected the switch. A trivial observation, the cup seemed lighter at the rim when Donato lifted it. The sound it made against his teeth as he raised it had a thinness I had not heard before. But I recorded dutifully names, the way fingers trembled, the placement of the chalice. Later that night, while refilling ink and listening to the echo of distant choirs in the stone vaults, I saw the gleam of the cup lying inverted beside the altar. The glare showed a reflection I did not intend to recognize at Donato's hand. Inside the curve, angles not to drink but to hide. I did not move. I pressed the palm of my hand onto the notebook until the paper whispered under my fingers. The telling does not come as a single loud event. It arrives as accumulated evidence. The cup was switched, not the entire vessel but a smaller, inner lining, a replacement lip that altered the flow, a cunning collar of silver that held a different taste. It was a subtle contrivance, a cup with a twin mouth. To the hungry, thirsty eye it looked the same. To the careful touch it betrayed the geography of a lie. The first to die slowly was the choir boy with the voice like an uncut bell. His lips closed mid-vowels and his breath grew thin as a pulled thread. He did not fall with spectacle. He sank with the genteel collapse of someone who believed he had traded a sin for peace. Others followed over days spaced like beads on a rosary, not a bloodbath, but a thinning of the liturgy. The room where we once counted bodies by song now counted them by the silence their absence made. Some endured in an altered state, eyes glassy, hands that shook, faces permanently bowed. Anna was one who looked like a ghost in a dress. She retained enough to remember those she loved and enough to weep without making a sound. I catalogued reactions with the clinical precision I had once applied to transcription. This was my sin and my refuge, documentation as complicity. I wrote the time of ingestion and the time of decline. I noted sleep cycles, the appearances of nightmares in waking hours, the faint tremble in fingers that once turned pages with crispness. I logged donors who came forward to distribute the mixture with Donato's blessing. And I marked the nights when Matteo's belt bore the weight of someone hauled from the assembly for asking too hard a question. There was a morning when Donato stood above an open ledger, as if to read the people like a hymn. He moved his lips into absolution and his eyes into plans. He started a program of selection. Those who fit an ideal robustness in body, monotony in devotion, willingness in submission he preserved. Those who deviated were offered the cup with a slightly altered bitterness. The switch was both surgical and rhetorical. It targeted not only bodies, but expectations. It was easier to thin a congregation if everyone agreed the thinning was sanctified. I discovered the replacement collar by accident. In the apothecary's shaded workbench, I had been procuring a tincture to hide a stain in the binding of my ledger. Lucia had left her vials open in the dim. A small silver ring lay half submerged in an oily dark. Its edges were filed smooth, and inside it bore a hairline notch the width of a paper thread. It fit the cup's rim as something cold fits the mouth. I could not fathom the reasoning without making an awful comprehension. Someone had engineered a variant of taste and paste to alter the body's acceptance of what crossed the lips. Why did Donato do it? He told us in sermons, in parables, in the 6 phrase movements that softened accusation that this was purification. He argued that to take the cup was to step forward willingly into a new order. But a new order requires selection. Donato had an image of a city cleansed of indecisive men, of a populace formed by a single, unflinching faith. He believed the ends would justify the means. He believed that purity could be forged in the slow heat of ritual. He had the charm to make murder sound like a sacrament. I am not a man of God nor of science, I am a man of records. My guilt is particular, I recorded while I watched. When the choir's voices grew less frequent, I made notes, then made more notes, then made corrections. My handwriting narrowed and tightened as if clutching a rope. I attempted at times to intervene, rearranging names, misplacing a date, small manipulations to keep accusation blurry. They did not change anything. The machinery adjusted around me. Matteo tightened surveillance. Lucia forced small apologies into the tinctures she sold, while the signature items of Donato's attire, the tarnished chalice, and the embroidered stole, remained the most effective weapons of persuasion. There is a way that cruelty organizes itself to look like necessity. Donato produced a syllabus of arguments that convinced many that elimination was a form of care. When the sick were taken in private, the whistling of the kettle and the clink of spoons masked the quieter departures. Matteo learned to move bodies as if relocating furniture. Lucia learned to seal vials in ways that left no trace. We became craftsmen of disappearance. Anna's survival was a paradox. She came out of it with memory intact and voice frayed. She remembers faces and songs and the feeling of a hand across her temple. She also remembers the weight of the cup and how its rim tasted like iron and then like ash. She kept a locket and she pressed it to her chest like an accusation against the world. She looks at me sometimes and her eyes ask whether I recorded her name with love or with the practiced indifference of a clerk. I cannot tell her. I cannot explain that my notebook was a place I hid my active shame. When the truth of the switch became too obvious to chalk up to coincidence, the dynamics shifted again. Denial, at first the kind that blames the quality of the wine, the temperament of the seasons, the fate of the poor. Then the aggression, those who asked too many questions found the door shut to them, or the rope around their shoulders, or the sudden necessity to depart for a pilgrimage that never materialized. Donato's rhetoric sharpened to an edge that could cut dissent into small servile pieces. The machine had found itself and changed its methods to preserve its ends. I have been asked by a private conscience whether I am telling this to absolve myself. I do not expect absolution. I do not believe ink can displace what my hands helped set in motion. I write because the ledger, precise and unblinking, has become my account book of atrocity. I write because I still hope order can be used to expose order. Perhaps that is vanity to use the same tool that helped structure the sermons to now dismantle them. But if vanity alone were at stake, I would have burned these pages and smoothed the wax. There were nights when, after the last candle guttered and the last breath of a sleeper became indistinguishable from the drafts through the stone, I would sit and feel the weight of the small iron pendant under my own robe. It is a poor talisman, nothing like the reliquaries the preacher wore, but it is constant. It hums to me like a minor chord when I make a note in the ledger. The pendant asks nothing. It reminds me only that the body is a repository of choices. In the wake of the choir's silence, there were attempts at reconstruction. Some in the congregation sought to reform ritual without the preacher. They wanted to keep the ritual but sever the mechanism of harm. They proposed new rites of mutual care and opened cups supervised by many hands. These efforts were fragile. The machine resisted. Donato's followers saw reform as a threat to salvation because they had invested their identity in the old arrangements. Matteo saw it as a threat to order. Lucia saw it as a threat to her leverage. I saw it as a truth to be recorded and preserved for a time when words might sway more than fear. Thus this chapter closes on a small respite. The choir exists in numbers diminished and in memory expanded. Anna walks with a stoop that suggests her body is still learning to trust the world. Lucia continues to work in shaded rooms and keeps her loop by the door. Matteo patrols with a jaw that tightens when anyone laughs too long. Donato preaches less openly now. He measures his sermons in smaller, more intimate gatherings. And I keep writing, a thin man bent by ink and the weight of memory. What really happened was far worse than you think, and yet what I have given here is only a scaffolding. There are names I do not speak. There are decisions I cannot fully confess. But in the ledger we kept, in the notes I make, the structure of the wrong is recorded. Some horrors are history written in blood. I write this to ensure they are also history written in ink. I write to give a future those dry, sharp facts, with the hope that someone may one day trace a line from our small, meticulous crimes to the larger patterns they became. To those who read, remember that systems do not need monsters, they require only willing gears. When a hand turns a wheel, ask where the axles are grazed. When a voice asks for trust, ask what it makes of the silent. And know that to record is not always to redeem, but it is one slow way to keep the world honest. I will continue to set down names, to mark times, to describe the rim of the cup and the angle of the hand that lifts it. If paper can prosecute, if history can subpoena, then perhaps my trembling chronicle will matter. For now, the candles burn low and the core is a memory like a painting left to flake at the edges. I place my quill to the next line and do the only thing I know that still feels like an act of resistance. I keep the ledger open. Chapter 6: The Switched Cup. I write with a hand that no longer trusts its own memory. For years the ink has been a thin lie I keep upon the page. A visible ledger that pretends to arrange and to anchor what my mind refuses to set in order. The ledger remembers what I tried to forget: names, measures, the cadence of the sermon, the arrangement of the cups, the small gestures that seemed to mean nothing until everything depended on them. I am Alessio, the scribe who sat near the altar and watched a choir raise their mouths to an idea of salvation and taste, instead the metallic air of endings. I do not offer absolution. I offer only the slow, antiseptic accounting of what transpired beneath the candlelight, because numbers do not soften as readily as memory, and because, perversely, the ledger feels like the only honest thing I still own. Donato's voice had always been a measuring instrument. He spoke with a particular precision that could make devotion sound like arithmetic crisp clauses, a cadence that disciplined breathing, lists that made the abstract look like a formula one could follow. He taught that sin had weight and could be removed if one applied the correct subtractive method. He taught the congregation to line themselves against his hand as if he were a ruler, and they the objects to be measured. His sermons contained rules, enumerations, and a ritual at the end so exact that the simplest motions seemed irrefutable. A cup, a blessing, a sip, these were the choreography of faith, straightforward from the back pew where people saw only the surface. I sat closer and saw the interior drawings, the small fiddles behind the clockwork. I was the one who copied his words into the ledger, who transcribed the prayers into neat columns, and annotated the roll of names, who accepted his way. I kept margin notes for him, cadence, suggestions, emphasis marks, a reminder here or a softened phrase there. From my place to his left I watched his fingers, when they blessed the chalice, and noticed the temblor in them that might have been ordinary tiredness, or might have been something like strain. I watched Matteo's barked commands with the detached eye of a clerk, noting a persistent background noise, and Lucia's hands, careful, unhurried hands that weighed and poured as one might conduct a delicate accounting. I was close enough to see too much, and not close enough to intervene at the exact minute a switch would be made. That fact has pressed on me like a stone. They called the ceremony purification. Donato shaped the language until the congregation could imagine sin as a poison inside, a rot that pooled and ate at the architecture of a person's soul. He promised that a single draught could purge that rot and make the soul fit again, a cure, he said, performed with solemnity rather than jurisprudence. The cups he lifted were plain pewter, dented and pocked by use, familiar to everyone who came to that underground chamber. He raised the chalice, intoned the formula, and the faithful drank, one after another, eyes fixed on the preacher as if salvation were a thing that happened between his hands. The rhythm steadied them. It steadied me too. In a way there is a mercy in order, in sequences you can anticipate. He offered that mercy at the tip of a spoon. The measures were precise. Lucia ran the apothecary with a tradesman's thoroughness, assembling tinctures and balms on a workbench that always smelled of crushed mint and iron. Her glass vials caught candlelight and made small suns on the table. She catalogued herbs by scent and tinctures by hue, and she weighed and recorded everything. Matteo handled logistics and the quiet violence required to keep the choir in line. Donato was the architect, Matteo the mason of Forza, Lucia the one who mixed the mortar. I wrote every measure and every scheduled appearance, as if putting ink to paper were immunity. The ledger would be my shield, I thought. Paper would prevent erosion. There were calibrations before the larger rites, small tests on the outskirts of the congregation, doses for those who wandered in desperate or drunk, quiet experiments measured for time and observed for effect. Donato demanded evidence or a convulsion here, a fevered repentance there, a visible realignment of posture that could be catalogued as success. He wanted suffering of the body to align with the rearrangement of the mind. That is how he taught by demonstration. That is how he controlled by visible consequence. When he needed larger compliance, he called public gatherings and promised purification for the whole. The choir came like tides to a bell, and I sat and recorded the way their faces folded into prayer. On the night the cups were ordered for the grander rite, the chamber was packed. Candle stubs leaned on windowsills and dripped like tears, beeswax scent thick in the air. The room did not so much close as narrow under expectation. The rafters seemed to hold their breath. Donato took the pulpit with a deliberate swagger and arranged the chalice as though presenting a relic. Silence coagulated in the rafters. The only motion was flame. I sat, ledger on my lap, convinced that observation was a firewall. The believer in me, or the clerk's variant of it, thought that if I wrote precisely enough, if I recorded carefully enough, then the truth of what happened would survive, even if I did not step into the stream of things. He spoke of ruin, repair, of a city cleansed of slough, and of order reborn by the willing suffering of the few. He spoke so that the crowd would fold inward and believe themselves instrumency. He taught them to be honest with the instrumentality of pain. The cups passed in a long, steady current. Matteo moved them from hand to hand like a man moving plates in a kitchen. Lucia was the shadow among shadows, her arms laden with bottles. She moved in the margins, her face a mask of concentration. I recorded the roll call. I saw Matteo smile without humor when he slipped a pewter cup into someone's hand. I watched Lucia's eyes meet mine for a single instant. There was no theater in that glance, only the architecture of someone calculating for survival. The first signs were subtle: a cuff at the back, a child's head that slumped once and did not right itself. People reclined, their eyelids fluttered like moths near a lamp. The preacher's voice did not break. He turned his blessing into a metronome and pressed the congregation into rhythm, tightening them like strings on a cracked instrument. I wrote faster. My quill became a needle through vellum, an instrument of registration. Orders, names, reactions, the ledger filled like a ledger must, as if consequence were an item to be itemized. Then the choir began to stutter. A man who had been sure of his own devoutness faltered, and placed a hand on his chest. Candlelight painted his face in chiaroscuro, half alive, half a carved shadow. Matteo began to bark instructions. Lucia moved with a quiet urgency, but not toward the stricken. She moved toward the pewter cups, her fingers tracing their rims as if seeking an answer in metal. For a time, the mechanics of the room were more persuasive than panic. People waited for instruction. The ritual had been trusted for years. Trust is a slow thing to shred. I did not notice the crucial switch until Donato lifted his own cup. He had poured, had shown his lips pressed to metal as proof and demonstration. The crowd's eyes followed his motion like a choir trained to synchronize. Ritual demands the leader share the same measure he prescribes. It validates doctrine. He lifted and drank as he had hundreds of times. Only then did his hand, the hand that so often performed authority as if by rote, hold the cup and not set it down. He examined the rim as though the chalice itself had altered. His fingers trembled in a different way, not the practiced tremor of long sermons, but a tiny rebellion of muscle that suggested inspection rather than performance. At first he did not cough. He did not collapse like the others. He held the chalice and stared at it longer than devotion required, longer than pageantry allowed. The candlelight sharpened his features into knife edges. I noted these things not for reputation, but because the ledger's cold lines would keep me from inventing courage. He paused. He hesitated in a way that broke the spell over the room. Matteo recoiled. His stomp stopped like a stopped clock. Lucia's hand hovered the instruments of the apothecary mid-motion as if the world had briefly dissolved its rules. Then Donato's eyes found mine. In that heartbeat I believed he had seen through me, the way a surgeon sees through gauze. There was an inquiry there, a ledger of its own accounting, not accusatory but curious, searching. He did not shout. He did not denounce. He set the cup aside as if its shape had become untrustworthy and gestured with a small, exacting hand for Matteo to secure the doors. The motion was economical and decisive. It was the motion of a man who understood containment had to come before explanation. This is the place I circle in thought until I am dizzy. Who moved the cup, and by what logic? Whoever had changed the tasting had not meant chaos. The substitution was clean and practiced, a sleeve, a nudge, a swap that to an untrained eye was nothing. Lucia had vials, Matteo had access. Donato had the authority to present his own body as the final measure. In the arithmetic of suspicion, the issue is not simply who could have done it, but who had the will to remake ritual into an instrument of harm. The swap was the smallest of mechanical alterations that altered everything. Donato's face altered in response to the discovery, though not with theatrical fury. There was recognition, and then the methodical folding of that recognition into plan. He ordered a halt, commanded Matteo to lock the doors. Matteo obeyed as if the doors were not merely wood, but the ribs of the city. And he moved through the pews with the pastoral brutality of a man convinced that force is a proof of piety. They divided the chamber, those stricken on one side, the unstricken on the other. The air tasted of iron and boiled herbs. Lucia drew vials and held them to the flicker, as if interrogating glass for lies. Her hands trembled, not from the guilt I later suspected, but from the stress of precision. She placed labels, checked weights, read and read lists like a woman who hoped she might find a mistake that absolved her. When Donato finally permitted a question, it came not as a scream but as a request for data. He sat at the work table and asked for the catalogue of mixtures used that night. Lucia presented her lists with mechanical deliberateness. I transcribed them into my ledger. They were as bland and particular as any tradesman's inventory: extracts of wormwood, tinctures steeped in laurel, a drop of something bitter for clarity. Yet it was the absence, the omission that cut: an unlisted vial, unlabeled, small enough to hide in a sleeve. Lucia's fingers trembled when that omission was noted. She did not deny the possibility in words. That small lack was a red mark on an otherwise neat page. Donato's reaction was not rage but calculus. He measured exposure and benefit like a man tallying columns. He did not howl for vengeance, he reoriented. He planned to stage a final confirmation of power under the mask of accountability, to examine the source, locate motive, and then name scapegoats sufficient to reassert control. He could turn betrayal into a pedagogy, a lesson about vigilance and devotion. He was skilled at folding unpleasant fact into a structured myth. That capacity was, in truth, his most dangerous talent. I have no right to absolve myself for what came next. My ledger contains the names of those who could not be saved, and at the bottom of the page, a smaller notation that makes my hand tremble when I read it: why I did not act. I rationalized by the sterile professionalisms men use to distance themselves. I was a recorder, not an actor. My duty was to witness and preserve. I told myself that the act of noting would be the seed of future justice, that paper could be a sword. I told myself all the things one tells to keep from moving. Silence is also an action, and I had lent it to the architecture that allowed violence. Matteo rounded up suspects of the pastoral hand turned coercive. He seized hands, bound wrists, dragged bodies to the corners, and searched sleeves with quick, practiced gestures that spoke of a man used to destroying evidence. It was only when he found a small brass, capped vial tucked into the hem of a cloak that the mechanics became ugly and particular. The vial was empty save for a traces of something that gleamed like a memory of metal. They turned the chamber inside out, and they turned my words into instruments of investigation. I watched as the ledger became evidence subpoenaing its author. They asked me to recount who had stood where, who had touched which cup. I recited as one might from the margin of a private confession. My voice sounded very small in that room. Later I found Lucia alone in the apothecary alcove with her shoulders drawn inward, as if the world had shrunk to the size of her own ribcage. She did not deny the vial, nor did she confess in the manner you might expect. Her admission was small and precise. She had been threatened into providing an unmarked sample to seal a debt that if she refused, her family would suffer. It was a currency I had not seen because it is earned in quiet. Her voice, when it came, was not for meh. She spoke in the language of someone trained to preserve the skin of things. She moved with the efficient, resigned motion of someone who had kept her head while the room around her burned. Donato did not erupt into righteous vengeance. He rearranged. He framed the episode as a final test, and then a disciplinary moment that would prove the congregation's robustness. He decided which measures to take so that blame would be distributed in a manner his order could survive and be seen to survive. He crafted a narrative in which the victims were both sinners and martyrs. Through semantic acrobatics, he preserved the sanctity of the rite and the authority of its leader. He could convert horrid fact into a tidy structure because that was his trade. Anna survived. I write her name differently in the ledger because she is proof that some thread of resistance remained. She had been given less of the mixture, or perhaps her body rejected what others could not. Whatever the mechanism, she woke and remembered. She remembers the faces of the dead and has not forgiven the architecture that led them there. Where the rest of the chamber leaned into ordered explanation, Anna's body kept the shape of a person not yet convinced. She has become a small, stubborn repository of memory, and for that she has been punished and protected in equal measure. She is the one who kept the story alive in the raw way memory holds pain, uneaten by the comforting gloss of doctrine. In the days that followed the rite, the city tightened its inspection of our chamber. Donato doubled down on ritual, extending sermons into layered reasoning meant to persuade the faithful to accept the losses as part of regeneration. Matteo's enforcement hardened, his motions became more mechanical and less human. Lucia slipped into the night more often, steps quick and furtive, as if seeking something bought in the dark that might undo a debt. I went on writing. The ledger took on an awful color it had never held before. It became, by default, an archive of culpability none wished to claim. My pages were both sword and indictment, and, like many sharp things, they made others wish they had been duller. I have tried to measure my complicity as one measures mercury on a scale. I can list the physical acts I performed, copying the sermons, arranging seating, confirming supply orders. These are small, dull items of paper against the immensity of what happened. But complicity is not only active participation, it is the slow permission of silence. In the margins I note the breaths I held. The silence that allowed the swap to go unnoticed was as much mine as anyone's. I have the ledger to show where hands were, what bottles were tollied, how the sequence unfolded. The ledger insists that I was there and that I did not act. I have thought of many ends for Donato. I have imagined him collapsing into penitence, his public censure, his exile. None of those endings satisfies the ledger, because they fail to undo the architecture I wrote in neat columns, how a doctrine bent people to an action that had no moral language to hold it. Systems recalibrate, leaders repurpose betrayal into lesson. They remake instruments for new ends. That is the work I feared he was capable of, and, in truth, the work he undertook swiftly. The ledger, that I believed might be a weapon against erosion, felt like an obsolete thing to men who could spin narrative out of disaster. Some nights I imagine setting the ledger alight. Chapter 7, The Cup's Benediction. I write this by a single guttering candle that trembles against the draught from the narrow window. My hand does not move with the ease it once knew. Each stroke of the quill collects a small, black testament along the seam of my fingers. The wax-stained quill sits heavy in my grasp, as if every letter labors under an added weight: memory, accusation, survival. I record not for absolution, but because to forget would be to betray the hollowed shapes of those who drank and did not rise. What I set down here is the slow, terrible geometry of a persuasion that became ritual, and of a ritual that became slaughter. I am Alessio, the scribe. I kept the ledger, copied the sermons, noted the donations and the names that trembled like candles in a procession. I bore witness until the cup was passed to me and I felt the world tilt. The sermons began as small, fevered remedies to a city exhausted by fortune and famine. For months before Donato drew a following, the markets had been thin with the kind of hunger that gnaws at the edges of civility. Bread was often trade rather than purchase, and those who prospered did so in smaller increments and through fewer hairs. People gathered to swap rumor like a commodity, to measure misfortune by its commonness. Into that ache came Donato. He spoke in slow, burnished phrases that trimmed the edges of doubt. He arranged words as a smith arranges coals, heating them until they flared and clung. His voice had the patience of someone who had learned to wait for echoes, and then claim them as proof. The congregation, gathered in a cellar beneath a house of respectable stone, reacted less like a crowd and more like a body bent toward a single limb. They took his words into them. They let him name their shame and promise a neat excision. Their faith was not new here, it was impatient and hungry. Donato fed that hunger with images of purification and the worn logic of sacrifice. He spoke of clearing rot to let new grain grow, of cutting a diseased limb so the body might live. He offered a cup not as punishment, but as benediction, and they took it because he told them it would make them whole. It is a small cruelty, I have learned, to be told that the world will be simpler if one gives away the complexity of grief. The cup was presented with ceremony, wrapped in ritual so that consent could be turned into a movement, into a thing that folded itself into the town's daily breath. At first the cups were a private ordinance for the particularly pious. Those with property and standing drank quietly, faces flushed with the solemnity of ceremony. It was a small gesture, a tremulous surrender to a charisma that smelled of cold incense and old iron. Matteo, the man who kept the congregation's order, wore devotion like armor. He enforced the ritual with a measured stomp and the clack of his keys. He stood in the doorway and let none leave once the calices were lifted. He had the posture of someone who had been given the right to judge, and he learned quickly how to make that right feel inevitable. The apothecary Lucia supplied tinctures and mixtures, her hands always stained with glass and herb. She moved among the shelves that smelled of dried citrus and furred roots, weighing her bargains on a brass scale whose pans were rimmed in verdigris. She balanced measures with the same steadiness she used to balance favors. A pinch more of one thing, a dash less of another, and she could make a draught taste like sacrament or like sleep. I catalogued their comings and goings, and I wrote until my eyes blurred, because the ledger was a place where facts could be pressed between thin bones of ink and kept from dissolving into rumor. Propaganda was not an artifice here, it was the architecture. Sermons were copied and distributed in careful hand, margins annotated with promises that read like prescriptions. Donato's cadence seeped into the parchment. I watched ink become an accomplice. The iron ring on his finger caught candlelight and became a sign. Whenever he lifted his hand to bless, my chest tightened as though some small animal had crawled beneath my ribs and would not come out. He cultivated a look of pious austerity, crimson trimmed with matte gold, a stole folded over his breast like a declaration. Patrons who wished to be seen as purer than others offered more than coin. They gave names. They gave bodies. They gave the trust of their own households. The first time the cup was passed and someone did not rise, the room did not shudder but rearranged itself. The absence was handled with liturgies as if the city had prepared liturgies for absence. They consecrated the silence. They painted the stoppage as purification completed. I am not immune to the efficacy of ritual. I know how relief can look like truth. But there were things that could not be made tidy. A mother who lifted a sleeve and found a pulse where none should be. An infant who slept and would not wake. The ledger holds those names in cramped script. I wrote, and the letters trembled with the same hand that had once tied my sandals as a child. Fear consolidated into structures inspections, late-night gatherings, sacramental lists. Donato's sermons grew sharper, and the crowd thickened until the cellar could no longer hold what it wanted to hold. We opened new rooms. We began to hold rites in loftier houses, in former merchants' parlors whose chandeliers had been stripped of crystal and rehung with prayerful intent. Carpets were rolled back to reveal flagstones that had never seen many feet, and those stones learned the sound of certain shoes, the stomp of Matteo's heel, the soft slipper of Donato's passage, until they bore those noises like a watermark. The faithful brought chairs, then cushions, then pallets, and a business of placement grew, where the poor sat versus where those of influence placed themselves, who ought to be nearest the place where the cup was blessed. Donato curated the layout with the ruthless calm of a man staging a tableau. Each repositioning taught people how to occupy their place in the new order and how to see the absence of others as part of that order. There were murmurs at the edges, of course. A man who ran a bakery said that his apprentice spat out the bread after a drink and would never eat again. A tailor could not find the strength to finish a seam and died, the needle falling from his fingers like a black raindrop. A woman who kept a small stall of pots and cloths slept and did not return to the stall. People whispered these things in corners, and sometimes they were met with a halting call to keep faith. Matteo struck those murmurs down. He had a way of turning suspicion into spectacle, marching a dissenting voice to the front and making it confess what he already decided it had done. He would set a bench near the brass lamp and demand that the dissent be spoken aloud. Faced with his measured fury, those who had spoken at random framed their own fear as sin. The zeal that wrapped around his jaw was more than devotion. It was a shield against doubt. I wrote these events with the same care as I wrote obligations, names, dates, small signs of degeneration. My role made me intimate with the machinery of persuasion. I learned which arguments bent shoulders and which cut throats. I kept the ledger because someone should keep score when the world tilts and calls the tilt righteousness. In the ledger I kept a private column, one the faithful did not see notes of dosage, oddities of speech, the way Donato favored certain phrases when danger gathered. These marginalia were not about doctrine, they were about anatomy, about how a system bent when force was applied. I kept them because I knew what happens when no one keeps anything at all. Memory collapses into rumor and rumor into myth, and the dead are turned into parables to keep the living orderly. Lucia kept her vials in a velvet-lined box that smelled of herb and metal. She was careful, precise, and ambiguous by design. Her eyes were narrow and green, assessing the world in small measures. People assumed she was loyal to Donato because she supplied the mixtures. They did not see how she tasted the room for advantage. She could have stopped what followed if she had chosen to. The knowledge to counter the mixtures sat in her apron pocket like a sharp seed, an ingredient pressed against her ribs. Instead, she kept a ledger of her own in a small leather book, and I wonder now what measures she recorded. Survival, I suppose, is a currency with many faces. She traded in assurance and in secrecy. I watched her once in the apothecary, hands moving over a brass scale, the light from the street lamp catching the rim of a glass bottle. She weighed out a substance with the deliberation of someone who knows that precision comforts the guilty. When she handed the vessel to Donato, he would nod, and no one in the room would ask questions about changes in measure, about whether a grain more would tip the balance. The hands that turned the vial belonged to someone who knew the weight of a brass scale and the angle at which light strikes glass. The choir, what remained of it, had a sound like paper burning. Song rose, then thinned, then fell away. They learned to make silence a part of the worship, as if silence could be mistaken for sanctity. They cut away crescendos, let phrases end mid-breath, taught themselves to hold notes like small, fragile bodies. Music, which once had been comfort, was folded into the architecture of removal. Anna was there at the edge of the congregation. She was small and fragile and wore a tattered shawl. Her eyes, blue-gray and quick to fill, learned to hold memory like a pressed leaf between two pages. She watched cups tilt and people fold their hands, and when the cup came to her she drank, because they told her it would make her whole. She survived with a bruise along her temple and a locket that did not open the way stories promise. Inside the locket was a portrait so faded it had lost the subject's eyes. Anna kept it pressed to her chest, as if the pressure might coax back what was gone. She kept calling out the names of those who did not rise, not in a voice loud enough to sway Matteo, but in that steady, tremulous way that registers in a ledger when one leaves margins. Anna did not know the language of the ledger. She knew instead the weight of a body gone from a room and the absence that smelled like lavender and dust. Her voice was not defiant, it was tenacious. Where others made their grief tidy, she kept the edges ragged, and that raggedness irritated the force that wanted to smooth everything into doctrine. The night the choir fell silent, we had already grown used to losing people. We had normalized the disappearance until grief fit into the margins. But something in the way Donato set the chalice against the candlelight made the room feel too small for the cruelty it would contain. He lifted it like a relic. Hands passed the cup without tremor. They had practiced this motion until their knuckles memorized it. I watched the rim catch wax and shadow. The cup made the slow arc from palm to mouth, faces closed, eyes lowered. For a moment I imagined the ledger as an open mouth that drank in their names so I would not have to carry them in my skin. My hand trembled when the cup came to me. I placed it to my mouth, because my oath as scribe had been perverted into a litany of participation. I had copied the lines that made them feel chosen. I had folded paper into creased promises. I drank because to refuse then would have been to announce dissent, and by that time dissent had become an invitation to the kind of correction Matteo considered holy. The liquid was smooth and cold. It tasted of metal and herbs and the edge of sleep. The sensation was complicated. It was neither immediate agony nor simple mercy. I do not remember the candle flame when the floor tilted, only a widening of the world and the sense that something within me had been unthreaded. When I came to, I found that the room had become an archive of bodies arranged like failed pledges. Afterwards came the reworking of meaning. Donato said that the fallen had been purified. Tongues at the edges of the city echoed the phrase as though global meaning could be replicated by volume. He spoke as if the dead were no longer losses to be counted, but proofs to be displayed. Matteo took pains to tidy the bodies and to give them small coats and tokens that signified burial. He wrapped them in linen, placed copper crosses upon their chests, and sent gravediggers with measured steps. He understood the economy of appearances. A tidy corpse is less likely to provoke a riot than one left to moulder in the open. Lucia washed the chalices and lined them up as though no imperfection had ever occurred. She did not look me in the eye when she slid a cloth across the rim of the brass. I watched the way her thumb paused over a specific chip as if she knew where to cover an imperfection with brightness. Anna gathered the small copper objects left behind, injured hands moving with a precise economy. Her face hardened into something that would not be read as strength by those who measured courage by noise. But there was a stubbornness in her economy, as if by collecting what others discarded she intended to inventory the absence. I tried to write my way out of it. Each line of the ledger became a finger laid along a slow wound. I catalogued the days and the names and the donations. I copied the sermons and left margin notes that reflected the curdle of my thought. I wrote what I saw: gestures, the angle of Donato's head when he declared absolution, Matteo's measured stomps, Lucia's thumb tapping glass, Anna's hands folded as if counting the dead. I avoided motives because motives are houses people build to avoid seeing the raw room within them. I described the facts because facts could be checked against a bedrock of materiality. Yet I knew the ledger would be used by the faithful to sanctify the slaughter, and by others to prove that a man named Donato had command over more than words. The ledger would be both a weapon and a confession. There is a quality to events like this that compresses time until everything seems like a painting viewed so close that one sees only brush strokes. Days telescoped into each other, market mornings that smelled of coffee and fish leading into evenings of chant shutters slammed before dusk became night. The city began to change its pace. Markets closed earlier. Windows shuttered with a speed I had not seen in my youth. Whispers gathered like cobwebs in corners. Donato's face became an image pressed into the town's imagination, an austere brow, the faint burn scar at the temple, a mouth that moved as if pronouncing mercy. He did not hide that he believed in the work. Most terrifying of all was that he might have believed it. Belief is an engine. It moves iron. It sounds like prayer until it becomes indistinguishable from the machine that drives it. I often tried to picture him in private, without his stole, without his assembly, the face of the man who became doctrine. Did he go to bed thinking of the ledger as I did, as a record to be corrected? Or did he see the ledger as a map of his power, a list to be used and added to? I do not know, and perhaps that is the worst part. The uncertainty of motive leaves only the clear shape of consequence. I am left with small things to recall: the pressure of my thumb on a page when I paused, the way candle wax pooled around the base of the chalice when no one noticed, the brittle sound of a hymn ending. My ink-stained fingertips refuse to wash the stain from the outside world. Ink absorbs into skin the way guilt does. I have tried to protect what is left of those alive. I wrote instructions in margins for people who would one day want to know exact ingredients and measurements, suspecting greed and malice in the same breath. I left clues to Lucia's scales and Matteo's keys. I described the pattern in which bodies were carried from rooms and how linen was folded when there was little time. These are not acts of courage so much as attempts at restitution. A ledger can be a map. It can be a weapon. It can be a beginning. There are passages I have written in a hand that I force nearly illegible, because the thought of another reading them now sharpens my chest. I detailed the measurement of a bitter root, the ratio of oil to water in a vessel, the way a liquor could be made to smell like wine. I am not proud of the skill I have preserved. It sits uneasily in me, a knowledge that helped and a knowledge that hurt. Yet information is also a way. Chapter 8: The Scribe's Testament. I began this ledger as an obligation and I end it as a confession. That is how a scribe measures his sins, by the ink that keeps crossing the same page. I have written sermons, lists of alms, the petty decrees of guilds, contracts for dowries. I have kept hours in dim rooms so small the breath of a candle felt like a verdict. I used to think the act of copying words could absolve the hands that scribed them. It cannot. The final strokes of this chapter are not an attempt to redeem myself. They are a record because records are dangerous. They can be offered to history as evidence, and evidence will not let us forget. I saw the cup raised the night the choir drank what they thought to be purification. I held the quill trembling, not from cold, but from the knowledge that I had signed each paste of paper with names and praises that fed the machine that led them to that table. I tell you now, without trying to dress the memory in piety, the preacher taught them to believe that death could be a sacrament. He taught it with cadence and eyesight. Donato did not merely sermonize it, he staged transfiguration with the hush of a stage director and the terror of a magistrate. Men and women came because they wanted to be made curious of sin, curious of absolution, curious enough to accept a chalice offered as ritual rather than medicine. When the first throat spasmed, when the first breath ceased between a smile and a falter, the room did not break into panic so much as sank into ritual. Matteo stood like a column, his palms white on a coffer, pressing bodies into order. Those who lived at once braided grief and doctrine into the same braided rope. Anna survived because survival is a lottery, and because someone small and careful had pulled her aside weeks earlier and told her how to feign fainting at the right time. I do not know if that counsel was kindness or calculation. I only know I recorded it. I have described the preacher's sermons before, in neutral ink, but the memory now is granular with the smell of beeswax and iron. Donato's voice was a well-polished instrument, deep, measured. He spoke of impurity as a stain that must be lifted. He spoke of the body as a vessel bearing the kingdom's rot. He would lift the chalice, and the candlelight made the tarnish on its rim a halof. People reached as if toward a relic. I measured the cadence and noted the rising hand, the tilt of the head, the practiced softness in his eyes that drew them in and convinced them that yielding was a sanctified act. That was his trade. He turned mortal fear into holy procedure. Lucia was the quiet calculus behind the mixtures. She arranged vials the way a miser arranges coin. Where others saw herbs, she read potency and ruin. She kept the glass vials at her belt and would tap them with the same thumb when she considered a measure. She had scars, faint burns on the forearm, and a clinical precision that kept her distant even from the preacher's fervor. I do not pretend she acted without motive. Every apothecary drinks from their own necessity. She wanted influence. She wanted leverage. Perhaps she wanted to survive the city's slow attrition by owning a secret that made men tremble. The cup that ended the choir was not ornate. It was tarnished, dented, the sort of chalice found in attics or monasteries stripped for need. Matteo's keys, heavy and utilitarian, glinted as he paced near the antechamber where the cups waited. He was not cruel because cruelty suited him. He was cruel because the doctrine required executors. To protect Donato's vision, he learned to silence dissent with a ragged morality. He once held a rope coiled at his hip and left fingerprints in flour that smeared across the lintel of the chapel like a map of intention. And I was there to note every name. That fact is the splinter under my skin that will not withdraw. I wrote the rosters for the gatherings. I transcribed the chants that softened the sound of swallowing into prayer. I made lists of those who sought the cleansing and those who opposed it. The ledger can be read by the light of any rational mind. Numbers, times, the sequence by which cups were passed. I can trace the trajectory of the switched chalice across the margin notes. Small marginalia, a scratched index of who drank first, observations about who trembled, which hands were steady. The marginale is an accomplice. I do not know who moved the vial. That is the terrible pivot on which the rest of this account swings. For weeks I inspected Lucia's bench, her parched herbs, the small brass scale. She worked in the thin hours when the city slept and the apothecary's lamp turned glass into gold. She knew potions as a ship's captain knows tides. She could make a tincture to brighten a brow or one to dull a mind. She told no one of a vial she kept separate, wrapped in cloth, its glass clouded with a residue like dried prayer. She said nothing. I wrote that she said nothing. The congregation believed the switch to be divine or destiny. They called it purification. Some whispered about traitors, about rival sects, about enemies of the preacher who bent doctrine like a blade. My own guilt is not resolved by alleging a single villain. If I name one hand, I name us all. It took a village of silence to make a switch effective, the willing blindness of the faithful, the careful thumbs of the apothecary, the merciless organization of the preacher, the willingness of those who guarded the rooms to accept what was presented as sacrament. We constructed a theatre of consent. Donato wrote the Linus and Lucia, provided the props. Matteo enforced the stage direction. I inked the playbill and sold it to the audience in copy after copy. Anna sang in the choir. She had a voice like something that had been slowly uncovered. It was delicate but honest, and people who listen to songs often think their souls are being inspected. She survived the poison, and in that survival she became a living reproach. Survivors do not comfort the living, they indict them. She moved among the scattered goblets and overturned candles like a ghost unwilling to leave the set. Afterwards, when the bodies were carried and the city tried to name the catastrophe in terms it could hold, the preacher walked as if through ash. He did not appear broken. Instead, he assumed a stillness that suggested sanctity. He pronounced benediction in soft statements that felt like measurements rather than consolations. Matteo tightened his jaw and took count of exits. Lucia polished the remaining vials as if there was nothing else to be done. I sat and filled pages with names. The ledger doubled with new folds, testaments, orations, requests for absolution. People came to me wanting words that made their hands smaller. I wrote them down. We buried the dead with hands that felt like strangers. The city's clerks counted and argued and wrote petitions to magistrates who widened their eyes and called it tragedy. Outside, beyond our thin chapel walls, commerce continued, carts rattled, apprentices argued about their masters' fees, lovers argued about who was owed what. The normalcy was a second violence. It insisted on itself while the living around us tried to reduce the world to calendar and account and legalese, so the world would not have to consider why an entire choir bowed to a pastor and opened their mouths to die. I have studied the moments that made the switch plausible. People crave order. Donato offered them an answer that made suffering meaningful. When you read a book and find it bending to a single idea, you become more likely to fold yourself into that idea. The good men and women who drank that night did not solely follow a madman, they followed themselves into a system that made murder look like sacrifice. My ledger shows the architecture of that persuasion, weeks of rhetoric that reduced complexity into a single exercise of faith or reinforcement of ritual. The slow institutionalization of commandments that asked for bodies. In the weeks that followed, the preachers following grew quiet and then fractal. Some fled, carrying with them the memory like a hot coal. Some stayed and laced themselves tighter into doctrine. Donato did not speak of guilt when it was most obvious. He spread his hands and spoke of testing, of trials that purified and the rare mercy of those chosen to go first. He taught acceptance as an art. Acceptance is a shroud stitched by rhetoric. I owed the city honesty and I failed. That is the particular weight I carry. The ledger can be used to indict, to convict, to warn other scribes, other towns. I have left in the margins an index of inconsistencies, irregularities in Lucius' inventory, Matteo's notes that contradict his own alibus. The preacher's sudden absence from one Sunday sermon, the way he would tilt his head at certain names, as though tasting them. I tried to be precise because precision is the only method by which a scribe can obstruct evasion. The law hungers for detail, memory corrodes. If this book survives, perhaps some magistrate will pull a thread and unravel the cloth. I am not hopeful. History is compassionate to narrative, not to truth. Anna would not forgive us with words. She became the keeper of memory for those who lost voices. She folded into herself, and then became something like a ledger of feeling, an index of grief someone might read to remember that these choices have faces. She touched the rim of the switched cup once, fingers lingering on a tarnish and then withdrawing. Her eyes watched me. She did not speak. She did not need to. The testimony in her gaze was a condemnation more efficient than any prosecutor. I catalogued my complicity because the act of naming is a form of reparation. I do not expect absolution, I only expect that ink can do what flesh often avoids. I wrote every sermon I transcribed, every name I copied, every time I amended a list to include a new convert. I recorded those who resisted and those who pressed forward. Names live on paper like graves that refuse to settle. They roast in the sun and fade, but they are still present enough to be read. The cup's echo is a long one. Even as new markets thrive on our street, the Troyes' absence reverberates in the hollow where sound once gathered. Candles sputter in the same rafters. The candlelight finds new faces and old habits. People keep using the language of purification because it provides a vocabulary that masks violence. We have always been adept at such masking. Donato's voice, in my memory, is not an isolated instrument but an inheritance. He taught tactics that will be taught again unless recorded and resisted. I leave this ledger sealed with the thin hope that time may give it teeth. If a future hand opens this book and reads that a preacher led hundreds to ingest what they called purity, and that an apothecary and an enforcer and a scribe participated in an act that killed more than it cleansed, then perhaps the record will cause a pause. That pause might be slow and small, but pauses are where systems falter. If it becomes a text that unsettles, then my guilt will not be useless. I will have converted my failing into an instrument against repetition. There is a ritual left to me that I cannot sleep past, to cross the names that must be crossed, and to leave annotations so the coluses of the city are visible. I write with a wax-stained quill, and sometimes the ink catches on the fiber of the page like a lodged bone. I breathe and sometimes place my hand on the page to feel its heat. The ledger is heavy now, its weight a private gravity that keeps drawing me back. I will continue to add until I exhaust the event into flatness, until the syllables have no more purchase, until the page resists the meaning and I am left with nothing but a plain, forensic account. I will not flatter myself that this alone will stop another preacher from staging a sermon with poison under the tongue. Men arrange themselves around power because it promises what they want. Yet words can be a scaffold to disassemble that power, if people read them and truly look, at how the mechanisms were assembled. That is why I write not to expiate, but to make a manual on how not to repeat. The last entry I make tonight will be simple names, dates, the position of the chalice at the time of pouring, the way Donato angled light toward faces, Lucius inventory note margin marked with an X Mattios patrol times. That is all the world requires of records enough to reconstruct a pattern. If any of you who read this ledger are inclined to mercy, then consider whether mercy must be applied to those who make maps of suffering as well as to those who follow them. I do not ask for leniency. I only ask that the record be truthful. I will close this chapter with the same hand I used to open it, steady, reluctant, thin. The city will continue to breathe and to forget, and then to remember in bursts, when the past presses against the present like a fist on glass. I have learned the shape of that fist. If history is a fever, then let these pages be the thermometer. Let them tell future hands what we did and how easily ritual can be made into slaughter. Let them say plainly that an ordinary cup, tarnished and dented, can carry a doctrine to its end. Let them know that the choir did not die because they were weak. They were taught to love the hand that killed them. What I ask of you who read these lines is not pity, it is attention. Watch how rhetoric arranges bodies into sacrifice, and ask why a society will let an altar be built for convenience. When you look at the ledger, you will see the scaffolding. If you choose to act on it, then perhaps the echo of that poisoned cup will finally meet an equal pressure from those who refuse to be made docile. I write because it is what I can do, an action of small consequence that hopes to become a defect in a larger pattern. The quill rests, the candle burns low. Outside, the city keeps its ordinary crimes and mercies. Inside, paper waits like a patient animal. I will wait to write more. The truth insists upon itself in this way. It is less forgiving than we are, but more durable than our excuses.